My following guest says courage is contagious. And if there's somebody who knows about courage, it's her. Maine's Secretary of State, Shenna Bellows, not only has been doing an exemplary job delivering for all of the people of Maine, but she's also running to be the next governor of that great state. I thought it was important to go back in time a little bit with Secretary Bellows to talk about her act of courage when she disqualified Donald Trump from the Republican primary ballot in Maine as a result of his involvement in the January 6th insurrection. And also talk about why it's so important for us to lean into our lived experiences to be able to make us better elected officials. Take a listen to my conversation with Secretary of State Shenna Bellows. And joining me now at the Katie Phang News Channel is the current Secretary of State Shenna Bellows for the great state of Maine, who's also, I know, going to be the next governor of the state of Maine. But Secretary Bellows, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I really appreciate it.
It's a real pleasure. I love being on your shows.
So let's start with the following, because for me, my personal kind of connection with you is still professional, but I was still at MSNBC and I was covering the news, the breaking news, when you disqualified then candidate Donald Trump from the Maine Republican primary ballot back in December of 2023, pursuant to Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, the insurrection clause. And for those of you that may or may not remember it, I'm just going to refresh everybody's recollection before we move forward. It says that no person shall be, and we'll say president, we'll skip forward and say president, or hold any office under the United States or under any state who, having previously taken an oath to support the Constitution, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same, or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. That's a direct quote to the Constitution. I know that you were following suit after Colorado had done the same, but I really did laud not only the creativity, but also, frankly, the courage to be able to do that, because this Section 3 movement, frankly, hasn't gone away. And there are a lot of us that still believe that that in and of itself should have been a disqualification. But can you kind of give us some inside baseball on what that was like to decide to do that, especially how politically charged the climate not only was then back then, but remains?
Absolutely. And first and foremost, Maine is a unique state. Like, we pride ourselves on our independence, our lobster, LL Bean. And we had a law that no other state in the country had, and that is to require the Secretary of State to ensure that every candidate meet the qualifications of the office they seek. So, and in the law, there's this citizens complaint process where citizens can challenge the qualifications of a candidate running and force the secretary to hold a hearing, to serve as a judge with both parties represented by attorneys, and then to issue a decision. And there are tight timelines in Maine law. That hearing has to be within 5 days, the decision within a week. Now, I had done those hearings before on pretty small potatoes races in Maine, right? So it wasn't unprecedented. But when citizens brought a complaint about Donald Trump's qualifications because of his incitement of January 6th, I had to have the biggest profile hearing of my career prior to. I mean, we're an independent state. We're also a fairly small state. And so, attorneys were represented on both sides. They presented the evidence. I reviewed hundreds of pages of documents, reviewed the videos from January 6th, reviewed Donald Trump's speeches at the time, his tweets. Remember, he was calling people to the Capitol for January 6th, and he was challenging the election results that he still challenges, because he's such a sore loser, perhaps the nation's biggest loser. And so I heard all of the evidence. I took a week to deliberate on the evidence. Colorado happened prior to me issuing that decision. And at the end of the day, in good conscience and in accordance with the oath I swore to uphold the Constitution and the laws of the land, I determined that he was responsible. He engaged in insurrection on January 6th, and that was disqualifying. You just read the plain text of the Constitution. There was no prior precedent for a president engaging in that level of insurrection. So I issued my decision. And, I remember talking to my husband the night before because he didn't know what I was going to do. And I said, look, I'm going to issue this decision tomorrow. I've talked to law enforcement and they're prepared for whatever happens, no matter what I do. And I knew that I could receive a lot of pushback, that it might be the end of my political career, that I would be threatened. I didn't quite anticipate the level of threats and everything that ensued.
Well, Secretary Bellows, I want to stay on this just for a minute or two longer because ultimately, to refresh people's recollection, the United States Supreme Court ended up deciding in the Colorado suit that made it there, Trump versus Anderson, that the states themselves cannot invoke the insurrection clause, that it actually is incumbent upon Congress to be able to take action when it comes to federal office holders or federal candidates. Now, I understand that there's nuances in the law. I've been a lawyer for several decades now. But what I really found to be frustrating about that decision was what you've just recited to the viewers, which is you thoughtfully conducted evidentiary hearings that took place wherein you actually had lawyers involved, the presentation of evidence, the hearing of arguments. And in Maine, you don't have to be a judge, let alone a lawyer to do it. It's a part of your job. So you were just doing your job as the Secretary of State, listening to the presentation of this and making a determination pursuant to the law that exists in your state. Because it's kind of ironic to me now because everything seems to be kicked back to the states now by the feds and by SCOTUS, right? But when you are exercising your independence in the state of Maine to make this decision for the constituents and for the people that are going to vote in Maine, somehow that's an overstep for you?
So the Supreme Court ruled against us, right? And the Supreme Court currently seems to be showing utter and complete deference to President Trump, throwing out decades, even centuries of legal precedents. And they seem to be completely in his pocket. Now, I swore an oath to uphold the Constitution. So when the Supreme Court said he shall be on the ballot, I adhered to that. But what I will say was really ugly is that Trump and his supporters across the nation, indeed internationally, targeted me and members of my family. So law enforcement advised us to seek a safe house. And I didn't share this on TV at the time. I didn't tell you or anyone else who was calling. I said we were away for the weekend, which was true. But we were away for the weekend and longer at the recommendation of law enforcement. And I can talk about it now because they found the person that swatted our home, generating a fake call to law enforcement, trying to generate that SWAT team response, that potentially violent confrontation between the homeowner and law enforcement. They found the person, they prosecuted him, DOJ actually did, and they found him guilty. He pled guilty. So he faced the consequences of that. And, my husband and I feel perfectly safe. But that was really unacceptable. And I think we've seen it. We saw it throughout 2024. We've seen it into 2025. The deliberate incitement of threats and targeting the judges who dare stand up to this administration. Members of Congress have talked about this, that they are scared. And then that really leaves the people questioning, who are you representing? Are you representing your own self or are you representing the people? And I determined, I went to work every day while we were in that safe house, and I determined that I was going to do my job no matter what, even when it's hard, even when I was getting targeted and threatened. And I think, in this time when fear is so contagious and cruelty seems to be the point and hate is an ascendancy, we have to remember courage is contagious too. And we have to continue to do the right thing, even when it's hard.
Well, and you continue to do the right thing. So instead of being dissuaded or cowed into submission, not only have you continued to defend the rights of all people in Maine, let me make sure this is clear. Regardless of party affiliation, you have done your job as the Secretary of State to make sure that the people of Maine are properly protected and represented. But now you actually want to go one step further and you want to be the governor of that state. I really wanted to mention this to the viewers, and I wanted to ask you if you would share a little bit more about this. I didn't know this until I was preparing to speak with you, but I did not know that you grew up in a log cabin in Maine and the daughter of a carpenter and a greenhouse worker that struggled to make ends meet, which is a story for a lot of American working families. But then you didn't have electricity or running water until you were in fifth grade. And the reason why I share this is not to garner sympathy, but to engender empathy, because you have a life and a lived experience that is unique to you, but has overlaps with so many people. And in the wake of the big bullshit bill from Trump and
Oh, that's a
sycophantic
good name.
Republicans, that's what I've been calling it. And you don't have to take it, but that's what I think it is. You know, in light of the wake of that, wherein a lot of people are feeling it, but not really going to feel it strategically because the Republicans staged a lot of the big negative parts of it to kick in post 2026 midterms. Talk about why that help frames who you are, your work ethic, your moral compass, and why you think it's important that Maine have somebody who's a governor who understands that things just don't come easy all the time to all people.
I'm so grateful for that childhood and for my parents because I think they raised me to be Maine tough and kind and tough. And I say that because, you know, I remember when my parents were first building our home, we lived in a tent that summer and they were digging out a cellar hole virtually by hand with help and then put a cap on it. And we lived in the basement that following winter. And the reason I have such a vivid memory of me, I was 4, my 3-year-old sister, my 2-year-old brother living in that basement is because, you know, one night this hurricane came in and I guess my parents didn't do the best job in making it watertight. So the water was coming in. So this is before cell phones, right? And so we drove up to about an hour to where my uncle lived. He wasn't home. His home was locked. So we had to drive somewhere else. It was another hour to where some friends lived. And that's where we spent the night. So the reason I believe in housing for all is because I understand firsthand how scary it is when you don't know where you're going to sleep at night. The reason I'm passionate about public education is because I entered kindergarten, still living in the basement with a lisp, and I had great teachers and free speech therapy. But for that, I wouldn't be Maine's first female Secretary of State. And the reason I believe in healthcare is, you know, whether it was the basement or the kerosene lamps we used until I was in the 5th grade, I have pretty bad asthma. Might have been genetic luck of the draw. And so an emergency room has saved my life more than once when I was a kid. And my parents went without health insurance in these blue collar jobs their whole lives. My dad got health insurance for the first time as a self-employed carpenter when the Affordable Care Act passed. Wow. My mom, she went back to school at age 49 and to become a nurse. And that, when she went back to school, was the first time through that school that she had health insurance. And she went into people's homes during COVID, taking care of COVID patients as a home healthcare nurse. And now, you know, she's retired, and she and my stepdad, they live on Social Security, and it's not much based on her career as a greenhouse worker and then a home healthcare nurse. And, you know, my stepdad, he uses a wheelchair. He's a double amputee because of health problems. And so when I saw that big bullshit bill that is cutting Medicare and Medicaid, I think immediately of my mom still living in the house we grew up in, you know, not a fancy log cabin, built through a model or by somebody else, but built with trees off of our land. And I think about everyone that I grew up with, who they're really struggling right now. And I think Trump appealed to some of those folks because they're so angry because they see people benefiting and they felt left out and left behind. And of course, ironically, all of the actions of the Trump administration is really going to further devastate their lives.
Yeah, that particular group of people, the American working families. And let me be clear, I think there's a little bit of a misconception that it is only targeting a specific wealth level or lack thereof. I mean, this really is just a billionaire boondoggle, in my opinion. But it's not just the blue collar families. I mean, it's a lot of people, inclusive of the middle class, that are going to be feeling this, if not already, with the increased prices. Why is it so important then? Because to your point, Maine is a small but independent state. Y'all have definitely made sure that you've made it clear that you guys walk your own path, walk to your own tune. But why is it so important then for you to take on this bigger role as the governor? Not to suggest it's necessarily higher, than the Secretary of State, because I think your job is actually critically important, especially these days. And we'll get to that in a minute when it comes to elections. But why continue in public service like this?
I think it is so important that we have strong leadership in this time. We have to fight back against the Trump administration. We have to see them in court. We have to challenge them at every moment. And I have the battle scars to prove it, that I can stand up and stand tough and fight for what is right, even when sometimes the outcomes look bleak. And then the other thing, and growing up in rural Maine, is we have to build some communities. We have to think creatively, like how are we going to provide healthcare to our people? Because in a place like Maine, where we have such a high percentage of people receiving Medicare and Medicaid, when those benefits are eviscerated, our rural hospitals are going to close. We're already seeing ERs and birthing centers close. So we're going to have to rethink how we do things. And so I think we need visionary leadership, tough leadership, and also the ability to fight for regular people, not for the oligarchs and the billionaires.
So tough but kind is a mantra that I actually teach to my 10-year-old daughter. And I've said, maybe people may come at me for this, but I've taught her too that sometimes you have to punch Billy back in the nose. But I do think that one of the critical examples as of late of you being tough and Maine tough is as the Secretary of State, the 50th Secretary of State for the state of Maine. Recently, the Department of Justice, and I think it's a disgusting name to call it the Civil Rights Division, because I don't think they actually respect civil rights anymore. But the voting section of the Civil Rights Division of the DOJ made a demand in July, at the end of July, for, in an unprecedented way, in my opinion, so much information and records concerning Maine voters. And I want my viewers to understand the following, because this is really important. Maine in 2024 was third in the nation in voter turnout, third in the entire United States. And in 2022, Maine was number one in the nation in voter turnout. More Maine citizens turned out to vote in 2024 than ever before in the history of the state. And as the Secretary of State, the elections is exclusively within your purview to have to maintain, to guarantee not only election integrity, but security. But they were asking for this sweeping scope of information and records, and you sent back the most comprehensive, polite yet scathing response on August 8th. To the DOJ, wherein you let them know that you not only had grave concerns about the overbroad scope of the request, but that frankly, they're not giving you enough information to be able to comply because they don't give you the justifications. And you basically told them literally to go jump in the Gulf of Maine. I mean, Secretary Bellows, talk about why we need to continuously be paying attention to the threats that this administration is posing to things like election data, voter data.
So first and foremost, what this administration is doing is breaking all precedents, breaking the rules, and it's throwing the Constitution out the window. And we have to continue to say no. And it can be exhausting, right? Because it feels like every day is a new outrage, but we have to be firm. So when the Justice Department asked for the sensitive, personal voter information, not just of me and Maine voters, but every Secretary of State is getting this request, according to DOJ. And remember, in 2016, the Trump administration tried to do the same thing. And to a state, every state said no. And so I've got to confess, I borrowed the phrase, go jump in the Gulf of Maine. Right. But like literally,
True.
it's, they're hot under the collar. They're coming in, trying to get this data. The Gulf of Maine is awfully cold. Maybe they needed to cool down. But in 2016, a Republican Secretary of State, Delbert Hosemann of Mississippi, said to Trump, go jump in the Gulf of Mexico, back when we could call it the Gulf of Mexico, right?
It still is the Gulf of Mexico, let's be clear. But yeah, I get it.
And so every secretary stood strong. And now we're in this environment where people seem so afraid, so cowed, or so seeking their own political advantage, their own ambition, that we have some of these states are just jumping right in and saying, yes, please, how can we help you? Other states are feeling intimidated, feeling like perhaps they have to. But the Department of Justice doesn't get to have all of your information just because they want to. They have to have a good reason. And actually, federal privacy law has certain steps they're supposed to take before they're aggregating sensitive personal information of the citizenry. And also, just think for a moment, like, why do they want it? What is their reason? Because in the absence of a very good reason, you start to think, okay, well, how might they use it? And do we really want the Justice Department checking to see if you're a Democrat or a Republican before they make a decision about who to investigate for tax fraud or for another crime? I mean, the power of the federal government is significant. And so this idea that they're going to collect all of this information on everyone in the country is really out of bounds and very dangerous.
Well, they're also pushing the limits as well. We know Trump has tried to push an executive order concerning proof of citizenship, when frankly, the United States Constitution in and of itself says you can't vote unless you're a United States citizen. And there's already pre-existing penalties in that event. That's one aspect. But another one that I know that is very important to you and it's also been very important to me is the SAVE Act. The SAVE Act is facing debate in the United States Senate, but I know it's something that you've also been making sure that not only Maine voters are educated upon, but that frankly, all American voters understand what's at stake with the SAVE Act.
Yeah, so I run the Bureau of Motor Vehicles as Secretary of State. I'm one of the few that does. And we've been trying to modernize in a lot of different ways to make government work for the people, to make it more efficient. And we've had to implement Real ID that requires documentary proof of citizenship or legal status.
Yep.
There was a deadline in May where the federal government, Trump said, you can't get on a plane unless you have the Real ID. And we immediately saw waves of people coming into our BMV branches. And what we've noticed is the people that have the hardest time getting the Real ID are not naturalized citizens. Their documents are in order. They are usually all set. The people that have the most difficult time are senior citizens and married women. Senior citizens, because they're least likely to have a birth certificate. And in a place like Maine, right on the Canadian border, we have some senior citizens that were born in Canada. So we have an immigration attorney on staff at the BMV who I recruited to help with our new Mainers.
Oh, wow.
Oftentimes, this immigration attorney is helping senior citizens in Maine prove their citizenship, even though they were born in Canada. These are folks that have served in wars, have been citizens their whole lives, but trying to prove that can be challenging. And then with married women, well, if your birth certificate says your maiden name, and if you're one of 85% of women who change their names when they marry, then the license or ID you're bringing to the BMV has a different name than your certified birth certificate. So then we need to see your marriage certificate. And if you've been married and divorced and married again, we may need to see all those chains of documentation. And for some women, to get that information, if they were married in another state or if they were divorced, maybe they got rid of their marriage certificate. They didn't want to think about it, but now they've got to track it down. And we need to see those official copies. So we've seen real problems with lots of citizens trying to get the Real ID. And I can't even imagine on election day if suddenly our election clerks were saying to married women and senior citizens, I'm sorry, your documents aren't in order. You can't vote. But that's exactly what will happen. And there are other populations as well, our transgender Mainers, poor people. There are lots of populations that are going to have a harder time proving citizenship or be more subjected to discrimination.
Well, yeah, I mean, and the last kind of group of people is really important. It's expensive to do this, even though you try to keep the cost down as somebody like the Secretary of State, for example, just obtaining copies of records isn't necessarily that easy. I also think there's a whole kind of rural component of this as well. It's already been baked in terms of voter suppression to make it difficult where you have to vote in person because now this whole Trump doesn't want the mail-in voting BS, right? I mean, we have all of that. But when you think about our rural voters as well, not only is there the geographic limitation, perhaps the transportation limitations, but frankly, it just disincentivizes you. If something's just more expensive and more difficult to do, what are you going to do? You're going to say, to hell with it. I'm not going to do it, which really creates baked in endemic problems when it comes to voting access.
100%. I think back to my childhood. There were times in our lives where we had one vehicle and my dad would take it to work. My mom would be home with us kids, or we'd be at school and she'd be at home. And then when he got home, she would go work nights. And they were working so hard just to make ends meet. The idea that, and budgets were so tight, I think for a lot of families, it's going to make voting out of reach. And then you pile on top of it this idea that Trump wants to ban mail-in voting so you can't get your ballot and mail it back. That's absurd. It is completely out of touch with what people's lives are like, what people are going through on the ground. And the SAVE Act is an example of that too. It shows a disconnect between the oligarchs, the folks in Washington who, they have assistants, they have people in their lives that do this stuff for them, and people who are just trying to make a living, just trying to get by.
So let people know, Secretary Bellows, I know they know where to find you, but specifically if they're interested in helping you out as you run to be the next governor of Maine, where can they find more information and find ways to help you?
Bellows for Maine, and that's the great state of Maine, MAINE.com. So check us out online, follow us on social, and yes, we're a grassroots, people-powered campaign. I'm traveling all across the state and would love support. If we need courage in these perilous times. We need leaders who are going to stand up and fight back no matter what. And you said it earlier, kindness and toughness. We need both.
Yeah, and I loved what you also said, which is courage is contagious. I think I've been very clear. My view is we shouldn't judge others for their level of advocacy. Some people may not be comfortable going and protesting in a street. Some people may be more comfortable doing a postcard campaign. Either way, being engaged is how we make it. It's how we make it through what we're going through right now. We're incredibly dark times, but part of engagement also includes finding candidates like you that are still and continue to do exceptional jobs in public service, still delivering amazingly well for the people of Maine, but at the same time seeking to continue to give. I mean, you really are an example, Secretary Bellows, of what public service is. A lot of people would just pack their bags up and say, thanks, peace out, I've had enough. This is for the birds, but this is definitely not something for you. And so I'm really grateful that you took the time to not only, kind of go down that path of memory lane with me over that crazy kind of time, but also to let us know that there are people like you that are fighting, because we have to do this. I look at Gavin Newsom and I look at others, our Texas Democrats and the breaking quorum. And I'm in Florida, I'm a blue dot in a red state, but there are those of us that are preparing and steeling ourselves for a redistricting battle as well. I mean, there is a lot going on, but it's refreshing to know that you are already in a position of leadership and you're continuing forward. So I really appreciate that.
Thank you. And thank you for your leadership. You're creating a platform for important voices. You're a voice for those that don't have one. So let's just keep speaking out. We'll find the joy in each other and our communities, but also we have to fight back. We have to stand up.
Maine Secretary of State, Shenna Bellows, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Katie Phang here. We launched the Katie Phang News Channel in partnership with the Midas Touch Network so we could bring you the latest in legal and political news. Straight, no chaser. So if you're a fellow truth teller, hit that subscribe button and share the word about this channel so we can build a high information America together.